Great, thanks Ahmed. And first of all, I'd like to thank very much the Catan Foundation, in particular Ahmed and Yazid, for bringing me over here. I've very much enjoyed my first time in Palestine, and it's been a really culturally enriching and eye-opening experience for me. And I think that there have been a lot of great conversations between myself and my new colleagues and friends that I think will bring a lot of new insight from a whole bunch of places to the ideas that we're talking about today. In a lot of ways, it's obviously very strange to be an Australian in Palestine. I mean, what am I doing here? I was thinking about this morning. I know what I'm doing here, Salim. Don't worry, we're fine. I was thinking about this morning on my way here, that Palestine is about as far away from Sydney that you can travel before you start going home. And to us, I started out my research career looking at the history of, Ottoman and Australian interaction, also something that you would be totally unaware of. But to us, this idea of the Near East is the far West. We are so divorced from these currents and these movements. Our Near East is New Zealand, which is also very interesting, but not as historical. But the really remarkable thing, I think, is that I'm sure that I want you to take away from this today is that Australia has a very, very deep and in many ways problematic connection with the Near East that began in 1914 when Australian troops were stationed in Cairo. And so we have the times, I'm a bit ashamed to say, and this is problematic for me, the times that Australians have set foot in Palestine has often been in wartime. We were here during the British campaign of 1916 to 18. We're here again in World War II. In World War II, we're also in the Maghreb at the great battles of El Alamein and Tobruk and occupying Jerusalem. And then more recently, obviously, Australian forces have been part of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So even though we have limited cultural ties with this region, we do have deep and problematic, have played a deep and problematic role in the 20th century of this area. But for many Australians, for Australian history, the First World War and the campaigns against the Ottoman Empire in Gallipoli first and then in Palestine towards the end of the war were very formative. They were actually extremely important nationalistic moments for the young Australian nation, which had federated in 1901 and which the First World War was its first test as an international polity where Australia could interact with the great nations on the world stage. And so by the end of the war, you had the newspapers in Australia writing things like this. The most important of all the discoveries of the First World War in Egypt and the Near East has been Australia. Out here in the oldest part of the world, amidst the ruins of successions of ancient civilization, this new nation has fixed its place in modern history and established for all mankind's admiration the character of its people. So I bet you didn't know that we discovered Australia in Palestine. Right? Now, what I want to do today is talk about three artists in particular whose journeys through Palestine had lasting impacts on the Australian cultural imagination and also Australian life. And there were quite a few Australian artists in the Middle East, in Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, and other areas. And this is in spite of the fact that pre-1914, we didn't have a great Orientalist tradition like the British and French and Germans and whoever else did of the grand tour through the Near East. So in the early 20th century, we had one artist couple who was called Emmanuel Phillips Fox and Ethel Carrick, and they followed Delacroix's path through Morocco and Algeria. And we had another Impressionist artist called Charles Conder, who summered in Morocco, and the story is apparently he went to Morocco because he had contracted venereal disease in London, so a great and glamorous history. And then we had a very famous Australian painter called Arthur Streeton, who in 1911, on his way to London, travelled through Cairo and other cities in Egypt and drew a travelogue of his times. But we didn't have that kind of the engagement that the Orientalist cultural imaginary didn't strike Australians until really 1917. And what happened then was that an Australian artist called Will Dyson, who was a satirical cartoonist in London, he approached the Australian High Commission in London and demanded to be sent to France in order to draw the lives and experiences of the Australian soldiers who were fighting along the Somme. And this gave rise to this scheme called the Australian Official War Arts Scheme, which is the longest running Australian art commissioning program. It's still going today. So this problematic thing of sending artists to war is actually a huge pillar of the recording of Australian history through visual culture. And because of this scheme, Australia actually sent its finest artists to the Western Front and to Palestine. Now, the first one I want to talk about is this guy, this photographer called Frank Hurley. Now, Frank Hurley, in 1917, when he was sent to France and then to Palestine, was one of the most famous photographers in the world. And he'd made his fame by joining an Antarctic explorer called Douglas Mawson on his 1911 to 1914 voyage to the magnetic South Pole. And when he was there, he took large format cameras and developed these beautiful colour plates of Antarctica and created a feature film about the dangers and bravery of Mawson reaching the magnetic pole. And this film was shown in Australia and London to great acclaim. It made him internationally famous as a filmmaker and as an artist. Hurley was one of this early generation of photographers who were involved in turning photography from its scientific and kind of studio uses towards a real art form. So he was a pioneer of what we call the pictorialist movement that was interested in the aesthetics of film. And so when he went to Antarctica, he looked at the landscape of Antarctica as kind of like a monumental stage where histories could be written on them. And so he followed this great tradition of Australian landscape artists of looking at the environment as a character and as a kind of a platform on which stories could be told. And he set himself up as a kind of adventuring hero. Hurley was very, very concerned with his identity. He was a celebrity. He was the closest thing that Australia could get to Kim Kardashian in the early 20th century, right? He was a dandy. He was very charming with the women. Apparently, he was rich. But in 1917, he was sent to France, and he immediately developed an absolute revulsion for war. And this is very, very typical of Australian artists' attitudes to war that also translates into their times in Palestine. They were not there for propagandistic reasons. They were interested in capturing experience. So Hurley was first sent to Belgium to this and took part in the Third Battle of Ypres. And this battle, Passchendaele here, was the absolute nadir of human civilization. He often put his life at risk because he took these big cameras, these big glass plate cameras that were very heavy and needed tripods and assistance, and he would follow the men through the artillery barrages, through the barbed wire as they went over the top. So he was almost killed several times. And this is typical of his attitude. The battlefield on which we won an advance of 1,500 yards was littered with bits of men, our own and Bosch, that's the Germans, and literally drenched with blood. It almost makes one doubt the very existence of a deity. The sooner this hellish barbarism is ended, God be praised, for few can see what real good can be gained. So in capturing war, he was very interested in the poetry of the landscape, let's say. When he was in France, he wanted to convey number one, the devastation of the experience, but he wanted to convey the whole of the experience, the smoke, the sounds, the movement, the gunfire, the land itself as it was being transformed. And he found that very, very difficult to do. He wrote in his diary, he was a prodigious writer, and he wrote in his diary that he was unable to take a photograph that could represent war because it was too static. And so he took to making these things, these pastiches, what he called composite images, what today we would call Photoshop. So he made these composite images in which he would go out over the battlefield several times and then take an image of a bomb blast and cut that out of the photo and re-expose it onto a different negative. And what that meant was that he could go out and collect all these experiences and then from his memory paste together different moments. That got him in big trouble with the army and with the official historian that Australia had sent to document the war, a man named Charles Bean, who was quite fanatical and forensic about collecting information. And so they came to loggerheads, and he almost quit. He threatened to quit and go back to Australia. So he was allowed to produce 6 of these composite sort of imaginary images, most of which he produced about Palestine. But because he was clashing so much with the army, he was actually, to sort of solve a problem, he was sent from France to cover the Palestine campaign. And in doing so, he actually, I'm going to argue, transformed aerial photography and also the technology of photography in the process. So he arrived in Palestine via Cairo just as after Gaza had finally been captured by the British and Australians. And he wrote when he arrived to Palestine, this is a theme that comes up with Australian artists. He said that compared to France, Palestine is more open, more free, and more like Australia, which is an odd thing to say. And he said after the barbarism and destruction of France, Palestine was a holiday, which is also a strange thing to say, but you can see how deeply he was affected by the war. In December 1917, he was given his first flight because there was a bomber squadron, an Australian Army Air Corps bomber squadron in Palestine. And so he was taken up for a couple of joyrides. And you can see here, that's him in the back seat, in the gunner's seat. And what he did was he replaced the machine gun and put a film camera on the pintle. And then he was taken up by the pilots. And this first experience transformed his life. He raved in his diary about the beauty of the landscape, out of combat, of course. And he took these sets of amazing photographs that were almost entirely concerned with the aesthetics of the landscape. So, for example, this one is of the Australian airfield, completely useless as reconnaissance, completely useless as for cartography and things like that. But you can obviously see why Hurley, as someone who was a pictorialist interested in the beauty of the image, why he took this photograph. So you can see that the aeroplanes, as they're taxiing out of their hangars, had produced these beautiful kind of geometric abstractions on the ground. They're very, very modernist, very much what what European artists are trying to extract from contemporary life at this point in time. And his photographs of Palestine from the air, apart from a couple of instances, have this lovely poetry to them that kind of belies the fact that he was an artist at war in the cockpit of a bomber. And so you can see again this photo of Jerusalem that he took that again is very useless as military intelligence. It doesn't record as military reconnaissance does the location, altitude of the flight. It doesn't look straight down, so it can't be used for photogrammetric analysis. And you can see he's more concerned with the beauty of the geometry, the terraces of the hills as they undulate. The patterns made by the roads. And while he was here, he made a film that was shown in London after the war. And the film was mostly staged because he'd arrived after the major fighting had been done. And he was allowed the use of these troopers who had not much else to do. And he would stage these kind of tableaux vivants where he would order the troops for aesthetic pleasure and take photographs of them, which we'll see in a minute. Now, maybe the most interesting of his Palestine photos is this composite image. So this is the closest, this is the closest he gets to kind of like picturesque Orientalist vision. So there's this photo of an Australian headquarters in this ruin, and then this of New Zealand soldiers, New Zealand mounted horse elsewhere. And what he did was he stitched the two together to form this ahistorical, I guess you'd call it Orientalist kind of vision of ruins and the New Zealand army beneath. So he made 3 of these pastiches, these composite images in Palestine. The other popular one, this one, is about 4 meters in length that he exhibited in 1919 in London at an exhibition of Australian photographers of the war that was mostly about Hurley. And his Palestine images were met with rave reviews. And indeed, the official historian of the Australian war said that it was Hurley who captured the nature of the Palestine campaign the best. And it was lauded in the press as the best exhibition of war photography that had been held in London. But an issue I want to raise is this idea of the complicity of the artist at war. Because these, I've been arguing that these are kind of aesthetic, artistic experiments, but we can't divorce them from the fact that the Australian forces were there to, invaded Palestine to defeat the Ottoman Empire. And Hurley himself was not exactly a non-combatant. He often went out, as I said before, and put himself in the line of fire. And when in Palestine, he went on patrol and was ambushed by an Ottoman patrol, and he and the driver that he were with were besieged for almost a day and a half and had to escape under gunfire back to their headquarters. They were presumed dead. This is another very interesting moment caught on camera where Hurley had set up his camera on the top of a building and they were strafed by a German reconnaissance plane. So really, really interesting moment. But the most problematic moment of Hurley's experience in Palestine was when, in February 1918, he accompanied the bombers on a bombing mission. And so, again, he replaced the machine gun at the back with his camera, and he took the most remarkable photos of the mission. So these ones are much more reconnaissance-like. But if you look carefully here, not even carefully at this size, but you can see the bomb. It's a bomb being dropped from Hurley's aircraft. So Hurley is far from an objective reporter or artist here. He's now become complicit in the violence. And if we look at this one, you can see that's an explosion. And so this weighed heavily on the mind of Hurley. And he wrote about the experience of going on this bombing mission in his diary, and this is what he said. And you can see that he feels tortured about his interest in the landscape and his role in wartime. I won't read all of it, you can read it, but I'll just read some of it. He said, "It all looked so peaceful that the mission of death and destruction on which we were bent, God knows, was hellish enough. And it would be an unnatural being who could look down upon the majesty of nature below, smiling and peaceful, and not feel regretful. The machines circled like great vultures over the doomed citadel, and I could distinctly see the large 100-pound bombs drop through the air. With a great detonation, one fell directly in the courtyard. God knows what heinous damage it wrought." And so Hurley was torn by his complicity. Now, we'll leave Hurley with a look at this other collection of works he made, and these are remarkable. So, mostly because of the fact that the fighting had died down when he arrived, he had a lot of time to technically produce his works. And he produced a series of 47 colour silver gelatin plates that are the only surviving colour plates of World War I. You may be familiar with coloured photographs of World War I that have been hand-tinted in hindsight, but these were natively colour. It's a remarkable technological achievement. He used on the battlefield. He used a technique called the Paget method. And because he had more time and the luxury of resources in Palestine, most of the works, most of these surviving colour plates are of Palestine, and they form a remarkable record of the Palestinian landscape at the time. For example, so you'll see that many of them have Australian soldiers in them, and these were the ones that were lent to him. So he would set them up to be in like these tableaux vivants and photograph them for effect. So you can see he also made a series of plates focusing on Jerusalem. Hurley was... Are you coming down to... Okay. Let me check what time it is. Hurley was a Catholic. He was originally from an Irish Catholic family, although he was quite secular back in Australia. But during his time at Palestine, he was keenly aware of the kind of biblical references to the land he was moving through. He was actually sent back as an official war photographer in the Second World War, but this time he was sent with a mandate to create propaganda images. So his intent and his focus in the works that he produced in the Second World War were very different. However, while he was in Jerusalem in, I think it was 1942, he produced a photo book of the old town of Jerusalem. Again, about 40-odd images, and this time he captioned each one with a verse from the Bible. So it seems that sometime between the First and Second World Wars, he became, I guess, kind of like spiritually interested in Jerusalem in particular as a site of historical Christianity. Okay, so I want to move on to a second artist now. Oh, not an artist, a second photographer. A man with a very strange name, Sir Hudson Fish. Now, Hudson Fish was, he served as a rifleman in the Australian Light Horse. The Australian Light Horse were a cavalry unit that was formed in Australia, mounted rifles, and they were the kind of iconic elite unit of the Australian Imperial Force. They also symbolised what it meant to be a nationalist Australian, because they were raised from the frontier, from the bush, and they were raised with the horseman's lifestyle of the Australian desert. So they had a certain cachet. And so Hudson Fish, he was another person who fell in love with flying in Palestine. So he went up for, a joyride as a light horseman, and then decided to train as part of the Australian Flying Corps. And he was commissioned as a gunnery officer, and he was a machine gunner. And he was one of very, very, very few Australians to be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross as an ace pilot. He shot down 5 German planes from the back seat of the bomber, including 2 on one particular bombing run. So he was a hero, well, a military hero. Anyway, he was also a reconnaissance photographer. And you can see the difference between army reconnaissance photos and the kind of artistic vision of Frank Hurley. So here, all of his photographs document things like railheads or munitions or captured baggage trains or strategic sites. And you can see what I was referencing before, right? You've got all the kind of geographical cartographic information that allow these things to be used as military intelligence. But what's really interesting, the really interesting thing, these are reconnaissance photos, they're a dime a dozen. But what's really interesting about Hudson Fish is the cultural legacy that he left on Australia. So he flew, his pilot, his name was Lieutenant McGuinness. And after the war, McGuinness and Hudson Fish tried to kickstart this kind of like, crazy race where they would try to fly from London to Australia. And they had the funding of some, businessmen to buy a plane and try to win this race. It didn't go ahead. So they returned to Australia and became advocates for aviation and went to a place in Queensland called Longreach. And there they started, you'll be familiar with this, they started Qantas, which is our national airline. And so this was all because of their love of aviation, that they became these heroic cultural icons now in Australian society. The final artist that I know my time's running out, but the final artist I want to address is a painter, very important Australian landscape painter by the name of George Lambert. George, this is him on the left, in the costume of the light horse brigade that they wore in Palestine. They had these things. There's a very particular Australian hat called the slouch hat, and they were characteristic of the light horse, and they were allowed to wear a feather in their hats, and they wore them at an angle to be kind of very fashionable, and that is George Lambert sketching in Palestine. So Lambert is one of the great pioneers of Australian painting, and he was that because he established this idea in Australian painting of the land being, the frontier being the birthplace of Australian character. So in 1899, he painted this painting called Across the Black Soil Plains, out in the outback, as it was then, a place called Dubbo. And this painting was received with kind of like rapturous applause by the Australian public. And what it depicts is just a wool train, right? But it symbolised the taming of the Australian frontier in the late colonial period, the success of the British colony in Sydney in establishing a foothold in this really inhospitable landscape. And it tied in with these notions that were in popular culture of this thing termed the coming man. So prior to Australia's federation in 1901, there had been a kind of, literary phenomenon that described the emergence of an Australian that was distinct from its British origins. And this Australian was the Bushman. The Bushman had suffered the privations of the harsh Australian desert and had arisen stronger and able to tame that environment. And that was the vision that Lambert was able to present in this painting. So you can see that there's this great sense of musculature here. Even the composition of the thing, the horse pulling really hard through the mud, and the paint is quite impasto. It's very thick. So if you see it in real life, it feels like they're pushing against something that won't relent. And there's a great sense of unity. Everything is united by this kind of diagonal. And it's also very masculine. It served that populist idea of the Australian bushman taming the desert. Now, when Lambert went to Palestine, Egypt, and later to Turkey, he brought that idea with him, and as did the other Australian painters who were who began their military careers in Cairo. the Australian popular press and the soldiers themselves were very aware that this young nation, the armed forces, were stepping on these lands of great prior Western and Eastern civilizations. And so sometimes they would paint pictures like this. On the left is a painting by a soldier artist called Frank Crozier of Australian soldiers sort of like training on the plains in front of the pyramids. And it reminded me of the swagger of Jean-Léon Gérôme's picture of Napoleon in front of the Sphinx. And the symbolism of the Australian army treading these like civilizational lands was not lost upon Lambert when he went to Turkey and Palestine. And so in his Middle Eastern paintings, you get this sense, the translation of the idea of the land being the protagonist, the frontier, the war frontier being an allegory for the Australian frontier, and that same sense of taming and work and masculinity and strength being the predominant characteristic of the Australian nation. So this is the painting he made of the landing at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles, and he included the symbolic peninsula that you see up there. It's called the Sphinx because it looks like a sphinx from the early morning. And so the Australian soldiers called it that because it reminded them of their training in Cairo, and it became this really mythological, landmark. And this thing about the desert is that it reflected this Australian myth about the tragedy of the founding of Australia. This is all very white history, obviously. We're not even talking about the colonial wars, but the white mythology about tragedy being an important part of the Australian experience. So this is the painting he painted at afterwards about Gallipoli, about this fatal charge at a place called Chunuk Bair, and where in the space of half an hour, 300 Australian boys were killed in the area of 2 tennis courts. And he actually went there in 1919, and the skeletons were still on the ground. So he and the historian Bean had to dig a mass grave for 300 skeletons, and he was deeply moved by this. But this is the most famous battle in Australian history, and it was a complete disaster and tragedy. And this is his most famous wartime painting because it tapped into the mythology of tragedy being essential to Australian life. So this is an interesting comparison. On the left, he painted a scene of the expedition of Burke and Wills, who were trying to go from Melbourne to the top of Australia. It's something like 3,000 kilometres each way. And they died on the way back. They arrived at this place called Cooper's Creek, only to find that their relief party had left about 3 hours before them, leaving no hope of rescue. And it's really interesting that Lambert began to translate some of those cultural imaginaries onto the Near Eastern landscape. So this is just a little sketch he did at Beersheba, but you can see a similarity in feeling and themes and forms and whatnot. But the thing is that Lambert was deeply moved by Palestine. When he arrived, he said that the light of Palestine reminded him more of Australia, the Australian outback, than any other place on earth. But what I think was really prescient of him to say was that, but Palestine has a light of its own and it must be approached on its own terms. And he was a fastidious observer of the landscape. He would rise before dawn and head up to the hills and make these beautiful oil sketches. And they're beautiful. They're instantly recognizable, aren't they? I think so. And they're extremely unique in Australian art history as well, because for the most part we don't have mountains, right? So they offer this kind of artistic view, this expanse and this play of light and form and shape that doesn't appear anywhere else. Now I just want to finish up. I've got 2 minutes. I just want to finish up with one final Lambert painting. So when he was there, he met a soldier, a light horseman called Thomas Henry Ivers, who was also an artist, but he hadn't been commissioned as an official Australian War artist. And Ivers acted as Lambert's assistant, helping him to prepare sketches and observations, his paints and all this kind of stuff. And the two of them formed a great friendship. And it was a friendship formed through also hardship. So when Lambert arrived in Palestine, he contracted malaria and it almost killed him. And the effects of that illness never left him. He never got better until he died in 1930. Ivers also contracted malaria. And there was a time when he was close to death, sickly, struggling. But the two of them, with no alternative, soldiered on. And Lambert crucially painted their relationship in this photograph called A Sergeant of the Light Horse in Palestine. And what's really interesting about this as a wartime portrait is that it's the complete opposite of a kind of a valorization. This was painted when Ivers was suffering from malaria, and he's very gaunt. He looks ragged. He looks weary with the burdens of the war. But he's also stoic. He's also, I guess, redoubtable and strong, and reliable. And it was those kinds of qualities that caused this painting to be recognised in Australian art history as the quintessential picture of the Australian soldier during World War I. Not because it's glorious, but because it reflected the cultural mythology of survival in the Australian outback. Ivers, who was himself an outback horseman, as was Lambert, had both travelled to this country, and in this country they had found something of themselves that they codified in these portraits. So this is known as the portrait of the Australian at war.